It was the kind of winter that folks in upstate New York still talk about decades later, not because it was the coldest or the snowiest, but because it felt like the world had simply stopped turning. The year was 1978, and a blizzard unlike any in recent memory rolled in with a quiet fury, swallowing roads, snapping power lines, and turning daylight into a swirling gray haze by mid-afternoon. Trees bent under the weight of ice, and the wind howled like it had something to say, but no one left outside to listen. Out on the edge of a small town, where the pavement gave way to gravel and then to nothing but frozen fields, stood a little white farmhouse with peeling paint and a crooked chimney. Smoke curled steadily from that chimney, a thin but stubborn thread of warmth against the storm. Inside, a woman in her late 60s moved slowly but surely through her kitchen, humming an old gospel tune under her breath. She wasn't tall, but she carried herself like someone who'd seen hard times and refused to let them win. Her hands were rough from years of gardening and scrubbing, but they moved with purpose, stirring a pot of beans on the stove, checking the woodpile by the back door, glancing out the window every few minutes like she expected something. Or someone. She lived alone now. Her husband had passed 10 winters back, and her children were grown, scattered across the country with families of their own. But loneliness never really settled in her house. She kept busy, tending her small garden in summer, canning vegetables in fall, and in winter like this one she'd read, mend clothes, or write long letters to her grandchildren. She believed in simple things: hot meals, clean sheets, and never turning away someone in need. It wasn't religion that drove her. It was just who she was. If you showed up at her door hungry or hurt, she'd feed you or patch you up before even asking your name. That afternoon, as the storm worsened, she listened to the radio crackle with warnings. Blizzard conditions, travel not advised, possible power outages. She'd heard it all before. She'd lived through worse. Still, she made sure her oil lamp was filled, her pantry stocked, and her wood stove burning strong. She wasn't scared. She'd faced down plenty in her life: segregation, loss, hard winters, but she'd always found a way through. And tonight, she figured, would be no different. Outside, the world disappeared. Snow piled against the windows. The wind screamed like it wanted in. But inside, it was quiet. Just the ticking of an old wall clock, the bubbling of stew on the stove, and the soft creak of floorboards under her slippers. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping sweet tea from a chipped mug, watching the snow swirl past the window. She didn't know it yet, but her quiet evening was about to change in a way she never could have imagined. Miles away, on a county road that vanished into the whiteout, 9 men on motorcycles were in serious trouble. They'd been riding together for hours, part of a brotherhood bound by loyalty, leather, and loud engines. They weren't looking for trouble, just heading home after a gathering with other chapters. But the storm hit faster than anyone predicted. One minute, the road was clear. The next, it was gone beneath a wall of snow. Their bikes skidded, stalled, and finally gave up. Engines died. Headlights dimmed. And soon, they were just 9 figures in black leather, trudging through knee-deep snow, numb fingers clutching handlebars that offered no help. They were tough men, used to handling themselves in rough situations. But nature didn't care how tough you were. The cold bit through their jackets. Their boots filled with slush. One of them stumbled, and another helped him up without a word. They knew if they didn't find shelter soon, they wouldn't make it through the night. Hope was fading fast. Then, through the blur of snow and wind, one of them saw it. A faint golden light in the distance. Not a street light, not a gas station, just a single warm glow in the middle of nowhere. It looked like a porch light, maybe a house. He pointed, and the others followed his gaze. They didn't speak. They just started walking toward it, each step heavier than the last, but with a flicker of something they hadn't felt in hours: hope. Back in the farmhouse, the woman heard it before she saw it: the muffled thud of boots on her porch, the low murmur of voices trying not to sound desperate. She set down her mug and walked to the door. Through the frosted glass, she saw shadows, big, hulking shapes wrapped in dark coats, faces half hidden under helmets and scarves. Anyone else might have locked the door tighter, called the sheriff, pretended not to be home. But not her. She opened the door without hesitation. Cold air rushed in, along with snow and the sharp scent of wet leather. Standing there were 9 strangers, bearded, tattooed, covered in ice, their eyes tired and wary. They looked like trouble to most folks. But she didn't see trouble. She saw men who were freezing, exhausted, and far from home. "Well, don't just stand out there," she said, her voice calm but firm, like she was scolding children who'd forgotten their manners. "You'll catch your death. Come on in." They hesitated, surprised, maybe even suspicious. They weren't used to kindness, especially not from someone who had every reason to be afraid of them. But the warmth pouring from that doorway was too strong to ignore. One by one, they stepped inside, ducking their heads like they were entering a church. She didn't ask who they were. Didn't ask where they'd come from. She just pointed to the stove. "Get yourselves warm. Take off those wet things. I'll put on more water for tea." And just like that, in the middle of a historic blizzard, in a tiny farmhouse no one would ever find on a map, an unlikely moment of grace began, not with fanfare, not with speeches, but with a pot of beans, a wood stove, and a woman who believed that everyone deserved a hot meal and a dry place to rest, no matter what they looked like or what patch they wore on their back. The road had vanished hours ago. What used to be a clear county route, gravel in some stretches, paved in others, was now just a white void, endless and shifting. Snow fell so thick it felt like walking through cotton, and the wind didn't just blow, it shoved like it had a grudge. 9 men, once loud and full of road-worn confidence, now moved in silence, shoulders hunched, heads down, boots sinking with every step. Their motorcycles, those roaring machines that usually carried them like kings of the open road, sat abandoned half a mile back, buried under drifts, engines frozen solid. They'd tried everything, pushed the bikes, dug them out, even lit a small fire under one engine, useless. The cold wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside their bones. Fingers burned with numbness. Eyelashes froze together. One of them kept rubbing his ears, whispering, "Don't let him go black," over and over like a prayer. They knew frostbite wasn't just pain. It was loss. Lose a toe, lose a finger, lose part of yourself to the cold forever. They weren't used to feeling helpless. These were men who fixed their own bikes, fought their own battles, and trusted only the brothers riding beside them. But nature didn't care about patches or reputations. Out here under the storm's white fist, they were just men, tired, scared, and running out of time. One of them, the oldest in the group, stopped walking and turned in a slow circle, squinting through the snow. "We're lost," he said. Not with panic, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd read the signs. No landmarks, no tire tracks, not even a telephone pole in sight. Just white in every direction. Another muttered a curse, kicking at the snow like it would help. But there was no anger left, just exhaustion. Then, through the haze, something flickered. At first, they thought it was a trick of the eyes, maybe a reflection off ice, or a memory of a diner sign they'd passed hours ago. But no, there it was again, a soft, steady glow, low to the ground, golden and real. A light. In a window? "House," someone said, voice cracking. They didn't cheer, didn't run. They just started walking toward it, faster now, hope pulling them like a rope. Every step hurt, but the light grew brighter. Soon they could make out the shape. A small farmhouse, roof sagging slightly under the snow, smoke curling from the chimney like a promise. And on the porch, a single bulb burning, casting a circle of warmth on the wooden steps. They reached the gate, half buried, rusted, but still standing. One of them pushed it open with a groan of metal, and they shuffled up the path, boots heavy with ice. They stood on the porch, dripping, shivering, unsure. Who lived out here? Would they even open the door? Most folks saw their vests, black leather, bold insignia, and shut the blinds before they got close. Cops gave them trouble. Store owners watched them like they'd steal the whole shelf. Kids were told to cross the street when they rode through town. So they waited, not knocking, just standing there like ghosts hoping to be seen. Inside, the woman had just stirred her pot of beans when she heard it, the creak of the porch steps under unfamiliar weight. Not the wind. Not an animal. People. She walked to the front window, wiped a patch of frost with her sleeve, and peered out. Her breath caught for just a second. 9 figures. Big, dark coats. Helmets tucked under arms. Tattoos peeking from collars. She recognized the look, the kind that made neighbors whisper and shopkeepers lock their registers. But she also saw what others might miss. The way one man leaned on another for support. How their shoulders shook not from anger but from cold. How their eyes, when they glanced toward the window, held not threat but desperation. She didn't hesitate. She walked to the door, unlatched it, and pulled it open wide. The cold rushed in, sharp and biting, but she didn't flinch. "Well," she said, hands on her hips. "You planning to stand out there all night? You'll freeze solid before sunrise." They stared at her, this small black woman in a faded house dress, standing barefoot in slippers, looking at them like they were late for dinner, not strangers in a storm. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we didn't mean to bother you. Our bikes went down back there. We saw your light." She nodded once, like that explained everything. "Then get in here before you drop dead on my porch. And wipe your boots. This floor ain't easy to scrub." They filed in slowly, awkwardly, ducking under the low doorway, careful not to touch anything. Snow melted off their jackets, puddling on the floor. They stood in a loose group near the stove, not speaking, not moving, like they were afraid to breathe too loud. She didn't ask for names. Didn't ask where they were headed or what club they rode with. She just pointed to a stack of old towels in the corner. "Dry off. Hang your wet things by the fire. I'll get you something hot to drink." She filled a big pot with water, set it on the stove, and pulled out mugs. Chipped, mismatched, but clean. Then she ladled stew into bowls, added extra cornbread from the oven, and set it all on the table like it was any other night. One of the men finally spoke, voice rough. "You don't know who we are." She looked at him, stirring sugar into a mug. "Does it matter right now? You're cold. You're hungry. That's all I need to know." He didn't answer, just took the mug she offered, wrapped his trembling hands around it, and closed his eyes as the steam hit his face. Outside, the blizzard raged on, howling like it wanted in. But inside, the air grew warmer, softer. The smell of beans and wood smoke filled the room. The men slowly shed their layers, revealing faces younger than they looked, some with scars, some with worry lines, all with eyes that had seen too much too soon. They ate in silence at first, too tired to talk, too stunned by the kindness. But then one chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd be sitting in a kitchen like this, eating stew with my brothers. In the middle of hell." The woman smiled just a little. "Honey, hell's outside. In here you're safe." And for the first time in a long time, they believed it. The kitchen filled with quiet sounds, the clink of spoons against bowls, the hiss of the wood stove, the soft crackle of drying leather near the hearth. Steam rose from mugs of sweet tea, curling into the air like gentle ghosts. The men sat hunched over the table, eating slowly at first, then with more hunger as warmth returned to their limbs. Their faces, once tight with cold and tension, began to soften. Shoulders dropped. Eyes stopped darting. For the first time in hours, maybe longer, they weren't on guard. The woman moved around them like she'd done this 100 times before. She refilled mugs without being asked, placed an extra blanket over the shoulders of the one who kept shivering, and stirred the pot of stew like it was just another Tuesday night. She didn't hover, didn't pry, but she watched quietly, carefully, making sure no one was in worse shape than they let on. One of the younger ones, his knuckles red and swollen from the cold, finally looked up. "You live out here all by yourself?" he asked, voice still rough but softer now. "Mostly," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Kids are grown. Grandbabies live down south. I like the quiet." He nodded, glancing around the room. The crocheted doilies, the framed photos on the wall, the Bible on the side table. It felt like stepping into another world, a world where people left doors unlocked, trusted strangers, and fed anyone who knocked. It wasn't anything like the life he knew. Another man, older, with a thick beard and tired eyes, cleared his throat. "We didn't mean to show up like this. We were supposed to be home last night. Storm came out of nowhere." She gave a small shrug. "Storms don't ask permission. Neither do folks in trouble. You're here now. That's enough." There was a pause. Then almost shyly, one of them asked, "You ain't scared of us?" She turned from the stove and looked at him. Really looked. Not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with the kind of steady gaze that sees past the surface. "Should I be?" He didn't answer right away. He knew what people saw when they looked at him and his brothers. Tattoos, leather vests, bikes that roared like thunder. They'd been called worse than criminals. Parents pulled their kids off sidewalks when they rode through town. Cops followed them for miles just because. Fear was something they were used to, expected even. But this woman, she didn't flinch, didn't clutch her purse or edge toward the phone. She just stood there, stirring her pot like they were neighbors who'd dropped by to borrow sugar. "I guess, Most folks are, he finally said. Well, she said, setting the spoon down. Most folks don't know you. I don't either. But I do know you walked through a blizzard to get here. That takes grit. And right now you're just cold men who need a hot meal. Ain't nothing scary about that. Something in the room shifted then. Not with words, but with feeling. The tension that had clung to them like ice began to melt. One of them let out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Another rubbed his face and laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised. You ever had company like us before? Someone asked. Can't say I have, she admitted, smiling faintly. But I've learned life don't always come in the package you expect. Sometimes Grace shows up on a motorcycle in the middle of a snowstorm. They chuckled at that, not loud but warm, like they remembered how to. As the night wore on, the storm outside didn't let up, but inside, time slowed. The woman brought out an old first aid kit and checked their hands and ears for frost nip. She made them soak their feet in warm water with Epsom salt. Don't argue, she said when one tried to refuse. I've seen frostbite take a toll. Ain't worth the pride. They obeyed without protest. She told them stories while they dried off, about her husband, who'd fixed engines for a living and could charm a mule into singing, about the garden she'd plant come spring if the ground ever thawed, about how she used to teach kids to read, and how every one of them, no matter how slow they started, could find their voice if you gave them time. In return, they shared bits of their own lives, not the wild tales people expected, but the quiet truths. One talked about his daughter, just turned 5, who drew him pictures every week. Another said he missed his dog, a scrappy mutt named Rusty who waited by the garage every time he left. They spoke of loyalty, of brotherhood, of how the club wasn't just about bikes, it was about having people who'd show up when no one else would. She listened without interrupting. Didn't judge, didn't offer advice, just let them be human. At one point, the oldest of the group looked around the cozy kitchen, the warm light, the smell of food, the sound of quiet conversation, and said, almost to himself, feels like home. She heard him, didn't say anything, just nodded and handed him another piece of cornbread. Later, when the fire burned low and the tea ran out, she showed them where they could sleep, on the living room floor, on couches, even on the big braided rug if they had to. Ain't fancy, she said, but it's dry and warm. They didn't argue. Just rolled up in the blankets she gave them, boots lined neatly by the door, vests folded like they were sacred. As she turned off the lamp and headed to her own room, one of them called out softly, Thank you. Ma'am, she paused in the doorway. Get some rest, she said. Tomorrow's another day. And with that, she left them, 9 rough-edged men, wrapped in quilts in a stranger's living room, breathing easy for the first time in a long while. Outside, the wind still howled, snow still fell, but inside that little farmhouse something rare had taken root. Not fear, not suspicion, but trust. Simple, quiet, and real. And sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. Or 9 of them. Morning came slow and gray, like the world was still catching its breath after the storm. Snow had stopped falling, but the sky hung low and heavy, pressing down on the fields like a thick blanket. Inside the farmhouse, the air was warm and still, scented with wood smoke and the last traces of last night's stew. The men stirred one by one, not to the roar of engines or the bark of orders, but to the soft clatter of a pot on the stove and the gentle hum of an old woman moving through her kitchen. She was already up, of course. Had been for hours. While they slept, she'd checked the wood pile, fed the chickens, what few braved the cold, and started a fresh pot of coffee, strong and black just how she liked it. Now she stood at the counter, cracking eggs into a bowl, glancing over her shoulder at the living room where her unexpected guests lay sprawled like shipwreck survivors washed ashore. One of them sat up first, rubbing his eyes like a kid. He looked around, confused for a second, then remembered. The storm, the cold, the light in the window. He saw her at the stove and froze, half afraid she'd changed her mind, that the kindness of last night was just a dream brought on by exhaustion. But she turned, saw him watching, and gave a small nod. Mornin'. Eggs'll be ready in a minute. You hungry? He nodded fast. Yes, ma'am, and… Thank you, again. She waved a hand like it was nothing. Go wake the others, and tell them to wash up before they come to the table. I don't feed dirty hands. He grinned, actually grinned, and went to rouse the rest. Soon the house filled with low voices, the creak of floorboards, the splash of water in the sink. They moved carefully, respectfully, like guests in a sacred place. No loud talk. No roughhousing. Just quiet gratitude. At the table, they ate like they hadn't in years. Scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, thick slices of bread with butter melting into every crack. She poured coffee into chipped mugs and set a jar of homemade blackberry jam in the center. "Help yourselves," she said. "Ain't much, but it's honest." They didn't just eat, they savored. One man closed his eyes after his first bite like he was memorizing the taste. Another kept glancing around the room, taking it all in. The crocheted Afghan over the couch. The radio playing soft gospel in the corner. The way sunlight finally broke through the clouds and hit the kitchen table like a blessing. After breakfast, they didn't wait to be asked. One went outside to check the depth of the snow. Another started stacking wood by the stove. A third, big, quiet, with hands like hammers, saw a draft coming through a cracked window pane and asked if she had any plastic or tape. When she pointed to a drawer, he spent the next hour sealing it tight, making sure not a single cold breath could sneak in. She watched them work, arms crossed, but her eyes were soft. "You don't have to do all that," she said. One of them looked up from splitting logs on the back porch. "Yeah, we do," he said simply. "You took us in when you didn't owe us a thing. Least we can do is make sure your house stays warm." She didn't argue, just brought him a mug of coffee and a clean rag to wipe his hands. As the day wore on, something strange happened. The fear that usually lived between people like them, the kind that made strangers cross the street or lock their doors, just vanished. They laughed over burnt toast. They shared stories about bad tattoos and worse haircuts. One even pulled out a harmonica and played a slow, mournful tune that made the whole room feel like it was swaying. She sat in her rocking chair, mending a tear in one of their jackets, listening. She didn't say much, but she smiled more than she had in months. At one point, the oldest of the group sat beside her. "You ever get lonely out here?" he asked gently. She paused her needle, looked out the window at the snow-covered fields. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but loneliness ain't about being alone. It's about feeling unseen. And right now," she glanced at him, then at the others, laughing, working, just being in her space. "Right now, I don't feel unseen at all." He didn't answer, just nodded like he understood more than she'd said. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow in gold and pink, they gathered on the porch, boots laced, vests back on, engines long since buried but hope returning. The roads were still bad, but plows had started working the main routes. They could make it home if they left soon. They stood in a loose circle, not speaking, just looking at the house, at her in the doorway. No one wanted to be the first to say goodbye. Finally, their leader, the one who carried himself like he'd seen every kind of storm, stepped forward. He wasn't showy, didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke, everyone listened. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick, "last night, you didn't just give us shelter. You gave us back our dignity. Most folks look at us and see trouble. You looked at us and saw men." He paused, swallowed hard. "We don't say things lightly. But from this day on, you got 9 men who'll drop everything if you ever need us. Day or night, rain or snow. Doesn't matter. You're under our protection now." The others nodded. Not with bravado, but with solemn promise. She didn't cry, didn't make a fuss, but her eyes glistened. She walked to the kitchen and came back with 9 small jars, each filled with her peach preserves, sealed with red lids and tied with twine. "Y'all take these," she said, pressing one into each of their hands. "And don't you dare say you don't like peaches. I watched you eat 3 slices of peach cobbler last night." They laughed, but their hands were careful as they took the jars, like they were holding something holy. "You come back," she said, softer now. "Not because you owe me, but because you're welcome here always." They didn't promise to visit, didn't make grand speeches, but as they fired up their bikes, miraculously dug out and warmed by teamwork, and rode off down the snow-dusted road, every one of them looked back at that little white house until it disappeared from view. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not just gratitude but kinship. A bond forged not in blood but in blizzard, beans, and the quiet courage of one woman who opened her door when the world said to lock it. She stood on the porch long after the sound of engines faded, arms wrapped around herself, watching the tracks they left in the snow. Then she turned, went inside, and closed the door, Not to shut the world out, but to hold the warmth in. Because sometimes the most powerful promises aren't written in ink or shouted from rooftops. Sometimes they're whispered over a kitchen table, sealed with a jar of preserves and kept for a lifetime. Weeks passed. Then months. Winter slowly gave way to the first green shoots of spring, and the snow that had buried the world melted into muddy puddles and swollen creeks. Life in the little farmhouse returned to its usual rhythm. Gardening, canning, Sunday radio sermons, and long afternoons on the porch with a cup of tea. But something had changed. Not in the house, not in the routine, but in the air around it. A quiet watchfulness. A presence even when no one was there. It started small. One morning she found a fresh cord of firewood stacked neatly by the back door. Split, dried, and ready to burn. No note, no footprints leading away. Just wood, left like a gift in the night. She didn't question it. She just brought it inside and added a log to the stove, smiling to herself. Then came the truck. Not loud. Not flashy. Just an old pickup, clean but worn, pulling into her driveway one afternoon. Two men got out. Leather vests under plain jackets, boots dusty from the road. They didn't knock. Just stood by the gate like they were waiting to be seen. She opened the door before they could say a word. "Took you long enough," she said, arms crossed but eyes warm. One of them grinned. "Roads were rough last month. Didn't want to show up looking like drowned rats again." They stayed for an hour, fixed a loose hinge on her barn door, checked the roof for winter damage, drank sweet tea on the porch while she told them about her tomatoes finally sprouting. Before they left, they handed her a paper bag, canned beans, coffee, a bar of good soap. "Clubhouse sent it," one said. "Said you might need it." She didn't argue, just nodded. "Tell him thank you, and tell him their preserves lasted me all winter." They laughed, climbed back in the truck and drove off. But not before one of them gave a small salute. 2 fingers to his temple, like a soldier acknowledging a commander. After that, it became a quiet rhythm. Every few weeks, someone would stop by. Sometimes it was one rider on a bike, engine rumbling like distant thunder. Other times it was 2 or 3 in a car, pulling up like they were just passing through, but always with something. A bag of groceries, a new shovel, a box of light bulbs. Once they replaced her broken porch step with solid oak, working in silence while she watched from the window, sipping tea. The town noticed, of course. People talked. Why are those men always at her place? Ain't safe. She's too trusting, but she never listened to the gossip. She knew what she saw. Men who showed up when they said they would, who fixed what was broken, who never asked for anything in return. One summer day, a local handyman came by offering to repair her roof for a fair price. He quoted a number that made her eyebrows lift. She knew shingles. She knew labor. And she knew she was being taken for a lonely old woman with no one to speak for her. She was about to send him off politely when, from down the road, a motorcycle appeared. Then another. Then 3 more. They didn't rev their engines. Didn't say a word. Just parked at the end of her driveway, sat on their bikes, and waited. The handyman looked from them to her, then back again. His smile faded. Maybe I'll come back another time," he mumbled, backing toward his truck. "You do that," she said calmly, and next time, quote a fair price, he left in a cloud of dust. The biker stayed another 10 minutes, just long enough to make sure he was gone, then gave her a wave and rode off. No drama, no threats, just presence. And that was enough. She never told them about the handyman, but somehow they knew, and they made sure it never happened again. As the years went by, the visits became part of her life, like the seasons, like the sunrise. New faces sometimes joined the old ones, but the respect never changed. The younger riders were always introduced properly. "This is Mama," one of the originals would say. "You treat her like your own." And they did. She never asked for help. But they gave it anyway, quietly, consistently. When her well pump failed in the dead of winter, a new one was installed by dawn. When her fence blew down in a storm, it was rebuilt before she even noticed it was gone. Once during a bad flu season, she woke up to find her porch lined with soup containers, medicine, and a handwritten note. "Get well soon. We got you." She kept that note in her Bible. The bond wasn't loud. It wasn't posted on signs or shouted in speeches. It lived in small things. A wave from the road, a jar of honey left on the step, a phone call just to check in. And every winter, without fail, someone would show up before the first snow and make sure her woodpile was full. Her windows sealed, her tires checked. To the outside world, it made no sense. A black grandmother in a quiet farmhouse protected by men society feared. But to them it made perfect sense. She had seen them when no one else would. She had offered warmth without condition. And in a world that often felt cold and judgmental, that kind of grace was worth guarding with everything they had. She never called them her guardians. Never treated them like bodyguards. To her, they were just family. The kind you choose, not the kind you're born with. And in return, they gave her something priceless. Peace of mind. The knowledge that no matter what happened, she wouldn't face it alone. One evening, as fireflies blinked in the yard and crickets sang in the tall grass, one of the original 9 sat with her on the porch. He was older now, hair more gray than black, but his eyes were the same. Steady, loyal. You know, he said quietly, most people think we're all about chaos, noise, trouble. But you showed us what real strength looks like. Quiet, kind, unshaken. She sipped her tea, watching the stars come out. Strength ain't about how loud you are, she said. It's about showing up when it matters. He nodded. And in that moment, under the wide summer sky, the promise made in a blizzard so many years ago didn't feel like a debt. It felt like a gift. Given freely, kept faithfully, and passed on quietly to anyone who needed to see that even the hardest hearts can be softened by a hot meal, a warm light, and a woman who believed in people before they believed in themselves. Time kept moving, as it always does, steady, quiet, and full of small changes. The woman's hair turned from salt and pepper to pure white. Her steps slowed a little, but her hands never stopped working, knitting socks for the grandkids, tending her garden, writing letters in careful cursive. And through it all, the presence of her unlikely protectors remained, a constant thread woven into the fabric of her days. By now, some of the original 9 were gone. One had passed in his sleep peaceful after a long ride through the mountains. Another moved west to be near his daughter. But their promise didn't die with them. It lived on, passed down like a sacred trust. Newer members of the club, men who hadn't been born when the blizzard hit, learned the story early. Not as legend, but as lesson. There's a lady out near Mill Creek, an older rider would say during a clubhouse meeting. She's family. You treat her like your own grandmother. No questions. And they did. When she turned 80, a plain white envelope appeared in her mailbox. Inside was a gift card to the local grocery, a hand-drawn birthday card from a biker's young son, and a note that simply read, "Happy birthday, Mama. Stay warm." She framed the card and hung it next to her kitchen calendar. But the real test of their bond came one cold October morning when she woke up coughing so hard she couldn't catch her breath. Her chest burned. Her legs felt weak. She tried to make tea, but her hands shook too much to lift the kettle. For the first time in years, she felt truly alone and afraid. She didn't have a phone nearby, didn't want to bother anyone, but somehow they knew. Later that day, a pickup pulled into the driveway. 2 riders got out, not the loud, flashy kind, but calm men with kind eyes and steady hands. They'd heard through the grapevine that she hadn't been seen on her porch in 2 days. That was all it took. They found her wrapped in a blanket on the couch, pale and shivering. Without a word, one called an ambulance while the other made broth and stoked the fire. When the paramedics arrived, the bikers stood back, respectful but watchful, making sure she was treated with care. At the hospital, the waiting room filled slowly. First 1, then 3, then 9, men in black vests sitting quietly in plastic chairs, some reading, some just staring at the floor. Nurses assumed they were distant relatives. Doctors nodded politely, unaware that these were men most people crossed the street to avoid. But to the staff, they were just worried family, bringing flowers, fruit baskets, and a thermos of her favorite sweet tea. One even brought her house cat who'd been left alone and meowing at the door. She stayed in the hospital for 5 days. Every single day, at least one of them was there, sitting in the hallway if they couldn't go in, checking with nurses, making sure her meals came on time. They never crowded her, never made a scene, just showed up like they always had. When she came home, her house was spotless. Her bed was made with fresh sheets. Her pantry was full, and on the kitchen table sat a new kettle, a box of herbal cough drops, and a note. Rest up. We're watching the place. Her great-grandchildren, who visited every summer, grew up thinking the bikers were just part of the family. To them, Uncle Razor, as they called the group's longtime leader, wasn't a fearsome outlaw. He was the man who taught them how to change a tire, told them wild but clean road stories, and always brought candy when he visited. They'd run out to greet the bikes like they were Santa's sleigh. Once, a school friend asked one of the kids, "Aren't you scared of those guys? They look so tough." The child just shrugged. "Nah, they're Mama's angels. They bring her peaches." And in a way, that's exactly what they were. Not angels in the heavenly sense, but earthly ones. Flawed, rough around the edges, but fiercely loyal. They didn't wear halos. They wore patches. But their actions spoke louder than any symbol ever could. Even as the years added more gray to their beards and more lines to their faces, they never forgot. Birthdays, holidays, storms, they marked them all. When a tree fell on her shed during a summer thunderstorm, 3 of them showed up before sunrise with chainsaws and tools. By noon, the shed was patched, the wood stacked, and the yard raked clean. She never asked. They never waited to be asked. In the town, well, the gossip never fully stopped. But over time, even the skeptics began to see the truth. These weren't men causing trouble. They were men keeping a promise. And the woman they protected wasn't foolish for trusting them. She was wise for seeing past the surface. One winter evening, as snow began to fall again, soft, gentle flakes this time, she sat by the window with a blanket over her lap. A motorcycle rumbled in the distance, growing louder, then stopping at her gate. An older rider stepped off, brushed snow from his shoulders, and walked up the path with a small package. He didn't knock, just held it out when she opened the door. "Peach preserves," he said with a smile. "Made 'em myself this summer. Thought you'd like a jar." She took it, her eyes shining. "You remembered." "Always," he said. They stood there for a moment, snow falling around them, silence full of everything they didn't need to say. Inside, the house was warm. The kettle whistled, and outside the world kept turning. But in that little corner of it, something rare and beautiful endured. A bond built on kindness, kept through loyalty, and never once broken. Not by time, not by distance, not by anything, because sometimes the strongest families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones who choose you, protect you, and show up year after year, just because you once opened your door on a cold, dark night. The years kept rolling, like leaves down a quiet country road, some golden, some stormy, but all carrying the woman further into the gentle hush of old age. She was in her early 90s now, her steps slower, her voice softer, but her eyes still sharp, still warm. She spent her days in her favorite chair by the window, watching birds flit between the trees, listening to the radio, or writing letters to her great-grandchildren who lived far away. Her hands, once strong enough to wring laundry and hoe rows of beans, now trembled slightly, but they still held a teacup steady, still folded laundry, still reached for the Bible on Sunday mornings, and through it all, the presence of her guardians never faded. If anything, it grew quieter, deeper, less about fixing fences or stacking wood and more about simply being there. They didn't need to say much anymore. A wave from the road, a nod through the window, a jar of honey left on the step with no note, because no note was needed. But time, as it always does, began to take its toll, not just on her, but on the men who'd sworn to protect her. One by one, the original 9 grew older too. Some retired from writing, others passed on, their boots hung up for good. But before they left this world, each made sure the next generation understood. She's ours to look after, always. Newer members, men who'd never seen the blizzard, never felt the sting of that frozen night, learned her story like a sacred oath. It wasn't told with drama or exaggeration, just truth, plain and simple. Back in '78, she took in 9 of ours when no one else would. Fed us, warmed us, treated us like human beings. We don't forget that. And we don't let anyone forget it either. So the visits continued, not out of duty but out of love, quiet, steady, and real. Then came the winter she got sick for good. It started with a cough that wouldn't quit. Then came the fever. Then the weakness that kept her in bed for days. Her doctor said it was pneumonia, common at her age but dangerous. She refused to go to the hospital at first. "I've weathered worse," she'd say, waving a frail hand. But her body was tired, and this time, it wasn't bouncing back. Word spread fast through the network that had watched over her for decades. Within hours, the driveway saw more traffic than it had in years. Not loud, not chaotic, just steady. One rider came with soup. Another brought medicine from a pharmacy an hour away. A third sat on her porch all night, just in case she needed something in the dark. When she finally agreed to go to the hospital, only because her great-granddaughter begged her, the waiting room filled within the hour. Men in black vests, some with gray in their beards, others young enough to be their sons, sat shoulder to shoulder on plastic chairs. They didn't talk much, didn't pace, just waited, eyes on the door, hearts heavy. Nurses and doctors moved past them without a second thought. To the staff, they were just concerned family, quiet, respectful, bringing flowers and clean blankets. No one guessed that these were men whose very presence once made towns lock their doors. Here, in this sterile hallway, they were just sons, brothers, uncles, worried, waiting, hoping. One of the older ones brought her cat in a carrier. Another had her favorite quilt folded over his arm. A younger rider stood by the vending machine buying juice boxes for the grandkids who'd come to visit, even though he'd never met them. Inside her room, she drifted in and out of sleep. But whenever she opened her eyes, someone was there, holding her hand, adjusting her pillow, reading to her from the worn Bible on her nightstand. She didn't need to speak. They knew what she needed. One afternoon, she was more alert than she'd been in days. Sunlight streamed through the blinds. She looked at the man sitting beside her, part of the original 9, now with deep lines around his eyes and a cane by his chair. "You boys," she whispered, her voice thin but clear. "You didn't have to keep your word all these years." He leaned closer, eyes glistening. "It wasn't just a word, Mama, it was a promise. And some promises, they're bigger than time." She smiled, a real smile, soft and knowing. "You all turned out all right," she said. "Better than most," he chuckled, squeezing her hand. "Only 'cause you showed us how." She closed her eyes again, but her smile stayed. For the next week, they took shifts, never leaving her alone. Even at night, one of them sat in the hallway, dozing in a chair, ready to stand if a nurse called or she stirred in her sleep. The hospital staff stopped questioning it. They just accepted it as part of her care, like oxygen or medicine. These men were part of her healing. When she finally came home, thin, weak, but breathing easier, they'd already prepared everything. Fresh sheets, hot meals in the fridge, a space heater by her bed, and on her nightstand a small framed photo, the 9 of them. Standing outside her house the spring after the blizzard, arms around each other, smiling like they'd just won the lottery. She kept that photo until the end. In the months that followed, her strength never fully returned, but her spirit did. She sat on the porch again, wrapped in blankets, watching the world go by. And every few days a bike would rumble down the road, slow to a stop, and a rider would walk up with a jar of peaches, a newspaper, or just a quiet, "How you doin', Mama?" She'd wave, offer tea if she could, and they'd sit together in comfortable silence, 2 souls connected by a moment decades ago that neither had ever forgotten. Her great-grandchildren visited more often, sensing the season was changing. They'd find her telling stories about the boys who looked after her, and the kids would listen wide-eyed, not because it sounded exciting, but because it sounded true. Not like a movie, not like a myth, just real life, messy, kind, and full of second chances. And in those final months, as the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp again, something beautiful settled over that little farmhouse. Peace. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from knowing you're loved, protected, and never forgotten. Because long after the blizzard had melted away, long after the world had moved on to new fears and new headlines, one simple truth remained, written not in ink but in actions, in loyalty, in jars of preserves and quiet porch-sit visits. She had opened her door to strangers in a storm, and they had spent the rest of their lives making sure she never felt alone again. She passed quietly, the way she'd lived, without fuss, without fanfare, just a soft breath out on a cool spring morning in 2004. The sun was already up, birds singing in the trees she'd planted decades ago, and the smell of damp earth and blooming lilacs filled the air. She was 94 years old, and she'd lived every one of those years with grace, grit, and an open heart. Her great-grandchildren found her in her favorite chair by the window, Bible in her lap, a half-finished cup of tea on the table beside her. Peaceful, ready, News traveled fast, not through phones or headlines, but through something older, deeper. Word of mouth, shared looks, and the quiet hum of motorcycle engines starting up across town. Within hours, the driveway filled, not with mourners in black suits, but with men in black leather, boots scuffed from miles of road, eyes red not from wind, but from tears they didn't try to hide. They didn't come to grieve loudly. They came to honor, to stand guard one last time. The funeral was held in the small church she'd attended since she was a girl, pews filled with family, neighbors, old students she'd taught, and shopkeepers who remembered her kindness. But in the back row, sitting straight-backed and silent, were 9 men, some original, some who'd joined the promise later, wearing their vests not as symbols of rebellion, but as badges of loyalty. They didn't speak during the service, just listened, heads bowed, hands folded over knees worn from years of kneeling, not in prayer alone, but in work, in waiting and watching over her. After the service, as the casket was carried to the cemetery, something happened that no one expected but everyone understood. The 9 lined up on either side of the path, standing at attention like soldiers at a state funeral. Not stiff, not showy, just still, respectful, present. Then, as the hearse pulled away, engines roared to life. Not all at once, but in a slow, rolling wave, like thunder answering thunder. One by one, motorcycles fired up down the road, until nearly 30 bikes idled in unison, a deep, steady rumble that shook the ground and filled the air like a hymn. They didn't race, just rode, slow, solemn, in perfect formation, escorting her to her final resting place. People along the route stopped what they were doing. Some crossed themselves. Others just watched, eyes wide as this unlikely procession passed. A line of tough-looking men on roaring machines riding not for chaos, but for love, for gratitude, for a promise kept. At the graveside, after the pastor spoke and the family placed flowers, the oldest of the original 9 stepped forward. He didn't say much, just placed a single jar of peach preserves, homemade, sealed with red wax, on top of the casket. Then he touched 2 fingers to his brow, turned and walked back to his brothers. No one clapped, no one spoke, but the silence said everything. In the weeks that followed, the house stood empty but not forgotten. The men made sure of that. They cleaned it out gently, saving her quilts, her teacups, her garden tools. They boxed up her letters, her photos, her recipes written in careful script on yellowed paper. Nothing was thrown away carelessly. Everything was treated like treasure because to them it was. Then came the garden. They didn't ask permission. Didn't make a big announcement. They just showed up one Saturday morning with shovels, seeds, and plans drawn on the back of a diner napkin, where her old vegetable patch had been. They built a community garden, raised beds, a small bench under the apple tree, a wooden sign carved by hand that read, "Mama's Garden, grow kindness here." The town pitched in. Kids from the school helped plant tomatoes. Neighbors donated tools. Even the local hardware store gave them lumber at cost. And every spring since, the garden blooms not just with vegetables and flowers, but with stories. Teachers bring students to learn about planting and patience. Families picnic under the tree. And every year, on the anniversary of her passing, someone leaves a jar of peaches on the bench. The house itself, they made sure it stayed standing. Repaired the roof, painted the shutters, kept the porch light burning every night, just like she used to. It's not a museum, not a shrine, just a home that's cared for because the woman who lived there taught them that some things are worth protecting long after they're gone. New writers still hear the story, not as a tall tale but as a lesson in what real honor looks like. You think being tough means scaring people? An older member might say to a young prospect, "Nah, real toughness is showing up when no one's watching. It's keeping your word when the person you promised it to ain't even here anymore." And they do. Even now, decades later. If you drive past that little farmhouse on a winter night, you might see tire tracks in the snow leading to the gate. You might hear the low rumble of an engine idling just long enough to check the woodpile or clear the walk. You won't see grand gestures, no speeches, no cameras, just quiet care, passed down, kept alive, never forgotten. Because what began in a blizzard with a door opening, a pot of stew, and 9 freezing strangers became something far bigger than any one person. It became proof that kindness doesn't need to be loud to be powerful, that trust can grow in the coldest places, and that sometimes the most unlikely bonds, between a black grandmother and men the world feared, can teach everyone around them what it really means to be human. Years later, one of the younger riders was asked why they still kept the promise. He thought for a moment, then said simply, "She saw us. Not the vests, not the rumors, just us, and that changed everything. And in the end, that's all it ever was. Someone seeing someone else clearly and choosing to help. No reward, no expectation. Just humanity, offered freely in the middle of a storm. And from that one act, a lifetime of loyalty grew, not because of who they were, but because of who she was. A woman who believed in people before they believed in themselves, and the men who spent their lives making sure the world never forgot her light.